June 6, 1944. The English Channel, aboard the USS Augusta. General Omar Nelson Bradley stood on the bridge of the cruiser USS Augusta and watched the coast of Normandy through his binoculars and waited for information that was not coming. The radios were jammed. The smoke from the naval bombardment and the burning vehicles on the beaches obscured his view. The reports that should have been flowing from the beach commanders back to Bradley's command ship were fragmented and contradictory and hours delayed. What Bradley knew was this: Utah Beach, on the western flank of the American sector, appeared to be proceeding reasonably well. Omaha Beach, on the eastern flank, was producing reports that ranged from bad to catastrophic. The 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division, the men who had gone in at Omaha, were taking casualties at rates that the planning had not anticipated, and the information Bradley was receiving suggested that the situation on the beach was not the controlled chaos of a successful amphibious assault, but the specific kind of disaster that occurs when everything that is supposed to suppress the enemy's defenses fails to suppress them. Bradley faced the decision that he would describe in his memoir as the most agonizing of his career. He could order a withdrawal from Omaha. He could shift additional troops to Utah, where the landing was going better. He could redirect the forces that were supposed to land at Omaha to other beaches where the situation was less severe. He did none of these things. He waited. He kept the ships and the follow-on forces committed to Omaha. He trusted the men on the beach to find a way through what they were experiencing, because the specific quality of American soldiers that Bradley had been observing since 1917 was the quality of men who found a way through. The decision to keep Omaha committed cost lives in the short term and saved the D-Day operation in the strategic sense, because the abandonment of Omaha would have left a significant gap in the Allied beachhead that German forces could have exploited to isolate and potentially destroy the Utah beachhead to the west. Bradley made the right decision in the worst possible circumstances. Omar Nelson Bradley was born in Clark, Missouri, on February 12, 1893, and grew up in a family and a community that gave him the specific values and the specific way of relating to other people that would define his military career. His father was a rural schoolteacher who died when Bradley was 14, and the son who inherited his father's intelligence and his father's unpretentious character grew up with the understanding that the people around him were equals rather than subordinates in every dimension of life except the organizational ones that military rank created. He was admitted to West Point in 1911, where his class included Dwight Eisenhower, the future Supreme Commander, and his academic performance was unremarkable in every dimension except military leadership, which he demonstrated not through the kind of dramatic performance that gets noted and remembered but through the consistent quality of his relationships with the men he worked with and led. Bradley graduated from West Point in 1915 in a class so distinguished that it would eventually be called the class the stars fell on, referring to the unusual proportion of general officers it produced. Among his classmates were Dwight Eisenhower and a cohort of future generals who would command American forces in the Second World War. He served in World War I but did not reach France before the armistice, a fact that he noted in his memoir with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a man who did not exaggerate his own experiences but who also understood that the specific education of combat was one he had not received in 1918. He received it in North Africa in 1943, when Eisenhower brought him to the theater following the Kasserine Pass disaster to assist in the evaluation and reorganization of American forces. Bradley's assignment was initially as Eisenhower's personal representative, a role that gave him the specific view of the American Army in the field that command at the Army Group level would eventually require him to have. What he found in Tunisia, and what he would document in the specific and honest assessments that characterized everything he wrote, was that the American Army had the material and the manpower to win the war it was fighting but had not yet developed the institutional competence and the leadership at every level that converting material and manpower into battlefield effectiveness required. He also found, in the men he observed and the officers he assessed, the specific American quality that he believed in with a conviction that his subsequent career consistently vindicated, that American soldiers, properly led and properly equipped, would outperform any enemy they faced, not because they were inherently superior in any meaningful sense, but because the specific combination of individual initiative and collective discipline that American military culture at its best produced was the right combination for the war of 1942 to 1945. He commanded the II Corps in the final phase of the North African campaign and in Sicily, gaining the experience and the reputation that led Eisenhower to give him the most important command assignment of the European campaign, the command of the American ground forces for Operation Overlord. Bradley planned the American portion of the D-Day landings with the specific thoroughness that was his professional signature, understanding every element of the plan and the assumptions behind it, anticipating the ways the plan could fail, and building in the flexibilities that a complex operation required without allowing the plan to become so complicated that its execution would require conditions that combat never provides. His management of the D-Day planning reflected qualities that were not naturally associated with greatness in the popular mythology of military leadership: caution, precision, systematic thinking, the ability to listen to subordinates and incorporate their knowledge into planning without the ego investment in a predetermined outcome that prevents bad commanders from using the knowledge their subordinates have. He was not theatrical. He did not perform for cameras or cultivate his public image with the deliberateness that MacArthur brought to self-presentation, or even the instinctive theatricality that Patton could not suppress. He wore a wool cap rather than a general's helmet. He visited the troops. He asked questions. He remembered the names of the men he talked to and the specific situations they described. The soldiers called him the GI's general, a nickname that captured both the sincerity of his concern for the men he commanded and the specific way that concern manifested in his command behavior. He cared about casualties not as statistics but as the specific price that specific men paid for the decisions he made, and that care shaped how he made decisions in ways that other commanders, who cared about casualties in the abstract rather than the personal, did not exhibit. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, which Patton's Third Army exploited after Bradley had created the conditions for it, was Bradley's most significant operational achievement. The concept that transformed what might have been another grinding attritional advance from the beaches into the dramatic sweep across France that characterized the summer of 1944 was Bradley's, developed in collaboration with his staff and executed with the combination of calculated risk and operational discipline that the specific moment required. Patton got the headlines for the sweep across France, as Patton always got the headlines because getting headlines was something Patton understood and pursued and was exceptionally good at. Bradley got the battle one. The relationship between Bradley and Patton was one of the most consequential personal dynamics of the European campaign, and it reflected a quality about Bradley that the relative absence of Bradley stories in the popular mythology of the Second World War obscures. Bradley was Patton's superior for most of the European campaign, a fact that Patton resisted emotionally because his instinct was that his own operational genius entitled him to a seniority that the organizational chart did not provide. Bradley managed this relationship with the specific combination of firmness about authority and generosity about recognition that the situation required, supporting Patton's operational freedom in the ways that maximized the Third Army's effectiveness while maintaining the strategic direction and the resource allocation that the campaign required. He gave Patton the freedom to do what Patton did best, which was advance aggressively and destroy enemy forces in open warfare. He also told Patton no when telling Patton no was necessary, and Patton, whatever his private feelings, complied, because Bradley's authority was clear and because the relationship between them, whatever its personal tensions, was grounded in a mutual respect that made compliance possible even when it was not comfortable. The command Bradley built by the end of the European campaign was the 12th Army Group, comprising 4 American armies and at its peak strength approximately 1,300,000 soldiers, the largest force ever commanded by an American general in combat. The campaign that force conducted from Normandy to Germany's unconditional surrender was the most significant American ground campaign since the Civil War. Bradley commanded it without drama and without the specific kind of theater that other commanders built around themselves, and as a result he is remembered less vividly than the men who served under him, which is precisely what he intended. He cared about the outcome, not the credit. He received credit anyway, in the specific form that matters most to soldiers, the respect of the men who served under him, who understood what he had done and what it had cost and who expressed that understanding in the simplest way available to them. They called him the GI's general. He was satisfied with that. Bradley became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1949, and in 1950 was promoted to General of the Army, the 5-star rank that placed him alongside Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton posthumously, and the other architects of the Second World War. He served in the Korean War era as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, where his testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee during the MacArthur hearings produced one of the most quoted assessments in the history of American military strategy. MacArthur had been advocating for expanding the Korean War to include strikes against Chinese territory, an escalation that would have risked direct conflict with both China and potentially the Soviet Union. Bradley, asked to assess the strategic wisdom of this approach, responded with the candor that had characterized his entire career. The wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. 7 words that captured the strategic assessment of a man who had spent his career thinking clearly about what wars were for and what wars cost, delivered in congressional testimony that settled the question of whether MacArthur's approach reflected sound strategic thinking as definitively as any 7 words in the history of American military debate. Bradley died on April 8, 1981, at the age of 88, the last surviving 5-star general of the United States Army. He had outlived Eisenhower and Marshall and MacArthur, had watched the country he had served change in ways that he had not always anticipated and had not always approved, and had remained throughout what he had always been, a Missouri boy who believed in the specific quality of the American soldier and who had devoted his career to making sure that soldier was commanded by people who understood that belief. He was the GI's general. The GIs who had fought for him, who had crossed the beaches of Normandy and swept across France and crossed the Rhine and accepted Germany's surrender, had given him that name. He had earned it on the Augusta on the morning of June 6, 1944, when he kept his troops committed to Omaha Beach instead of ordering the withdrawal that the situation seemed to demand, because he trusted the men on that beach to find a way through. They found a way through. They always did. Bradley had known they would. That is the whole of it. That is Omar Bradley. The wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. And before that, and more importantly, the right decision, on the right beach, at the right moment, because he trusted the right men to be what American soldiers are.